Hello and welcome to CBHX History, and today we're covering World War II and specifically the Homefront. You might be wondering what do we mean by the Homefront. Well, we are talking about the normal everyday people who were affected by the war, who did not directly take part in the fighting. We at CBHX History are hoping to provide crucial information about World War II.
To accomplish this, we have compiled stories all about younger citizens who were on the home front. By the end of this video, we want you to know how citizens of countries involved in World War II lived during the war. First, we will take the story of Joan Morrison, then Stephen, after that Henriette Dodd, and finally the story of Barlaw. Let's get right into the story of Joan Morrison.
Joanne Morrison was a young female who was just living her life. She was oblivious to what was happening in the war until it made itself known with America's inclusion in the Second World War. The first thing that she talks about in her diary is the Hindenburg disaster and how it had just recently happened, not even 3 hours of her writing it. Little did she know that the main things that began to affect her were coming. She writes about how the Allies sent Japan a letter demanding that they cut down their navies. She then writes about how it sounds like a war is about to break out. The next important entry she talks about is how America is going to war with Japan. There's an entry where she talks about Christmas and how it may be her last truly happy Christmas due to America going to war. This to me shows how even though the citizens aren't directly in the war, they are still affected by the war, and it also shows how not everything good lasts forever.
Stephen Pollack was raised in Poland until he was 19 years old. Then he joined the Polish army to fight for his country. One morning, he and his comrades were ordered to march to Warsaw to fight the Germans. On their way to Warsaw, Pollack was so terrified that he fled into the woods. After a little while, he was found by the Germans and taken in a truck full with many other captured men. Pollack and the other men were taken to Auschwitz, where they were inspected. Pollack was declared healthy and was put to work at the camp. Pollack described being forced to perform horrible tasks, such as checking the gas chambers to make sure everyone was dead, taking out the dead bodies, and digging mass graves for them all. After a few weeks, Pollack was taken to another camp called Mauthausen, where he would stay for 5 years before the camp was liberated. Pollack said that at night it was too dangerous to cross the field to use the toilet, so he would steal other men's clothes and pee in them. Since he knew that the others would do the same to him, he hid his clothes under his pillow at night. When Stephen was liberated from the camp, the soldiers asked him what his birthday was. When he said that he didn't know, they made one up for him. After that, he became a translator in the Americas because of the languages that he picked up while at the camp. This story was interesting because of the long and hard journey that this man was taken on because of one decision. I would have been terrified if I was this man. 5 years is a long time to be away from everything you're familiar with.
Next is the story of Henriette Dodd, who was born in Paris, France, and at an early age, her family moved to northern France to live in the country. She was a young girl at the age of 12 when war was declared in France. Her mom was a widow who ran a small hotel in a town called Chauny. When war was declared, the soldiers stationed near their town were in high spirits. The French soldiers had total confidence in the Maginot Line. They were eager to go teach the Germans a lesson on the front lines. The soldiers at the time were overly proud of themselves for being on the winning side of World War I. Because of this, they were ill-prepared and had an unhealthy amount of trust in the Maginot Line. Then there was the start of the Phony War. At this time, no one was engaging in conflict. During the Phony Wars, food started to become scarce and coupons started to get handed out. Then, Germans started their bombings, and Chauny was targeted for its sailway connection. Not too long after that, Germans, completely ignoring Belgium's neutrality, they watched right around the Maginot Line, and the Germans invaded northern France with little resistance because the French soldiers were not expecting an attack from that spot. That's when they had to start evacuating to the center of France. Henriette, along with her mother and grandmother, went to the center of France together. It must have been hard for them to leave their stuff behind, especially their poor cat. After the long trip, they made it to the rural part of Brive-la-Gaillarde. While they were there, they were allowed small and cramped living spaces, not to mention the food shortage was growing. Fast forward later, the Germans fully occupied France. At that time, they were sent back to their hometown, the food shortage only got shorter. They started living on only 1,200 calories a day. The Frenchmen who were not able to serve in the army were sent to Germany to work at factories. One of these men were her uncle. After a time, the Germans seemed to become more aggressive. Some Frenchmen were arrested without apparent reason, or were shot without explanation. One day, as Henriette was walking from home to her school, she was pushed in the doorway by a German soldier. When she gathers herself and looks at the soldier, she realizes he was hit by a machine gun. She was 17 at the time Germany was liberated from France. When it happened, the people were overwhelmingly happy and the population was extremely grateful to the Americans. Shortly after, the Frenchmen came home from their factories or hiding, and the food started to gradually come back too, little by little. This was Henriette's experience on the home front. This is a very informative story about the occupation of France and the home front. This girl was only 12 when she had to live and endure through horrible conditions made by the war. Not to mention how hard it must have been to have to go to bed hungry during the food shortages. Henriette gets my respect, and stories like these show that World War II affected everyone, not just the soldiers.
Immediately after establishing their communist state, Russian leaders Lenin and later Stalin established gulags as their primary prison system. And this is where the prison for my story, Varlam, ended up. Besides being a place to dump prisoners for unreasonable amounts of time, communist leaders used the gulag to imprison people who spoke out against them. Varlam was one of those people. After distributing a letter criticizing Lenin, he was imprisoned for a total of 17 years. In truth, the gulags were more labor camps than a place to house prisoners, where they were forced to work from sunup to sundown with very little to eat. Conditions were comparable to concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Clothes were lacerated, thin, and when combined with the sub-zero temperatures, amplified the suffering of the prisoners. Each year, 1/3 of them would die from malnutrition, frostbite, and hypothermia. After his experience in the gulag, Varlam was inspired to write multiple short stories loosely based on his time in the Russian prison system, but his work would not be allowed to be published in the Soviet Union until the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but was translated and widely distributed as a representation of the cruelty that went on behind the Iron Curtain. The important thing about this story is that people tend to ignore that Nazi Germany weren't the only ones committing atrocities, and no side in the war was as perfect as people tend to assume.
This episode was made to show different perspectives from the home front of World War II. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss episode 3, Genocide. You can also find in the description our sources for the stories and the BBC World War II page, which contains even more stories from people who lived during World War II.